Todd Young Online presents Young Tales. Tales for the young and the young at heart. Today's story, Bulfinch's Mythology, Stories of Gods and Heroes, The Adventures of Perseus. Now we start with a prelude about the Graeae and the Gorgons. The Graeae were three sisters, gray-haired from birth. Their very name derived from this peculiar trait. The Gorgons, in contrast, were fearsome creatures, monstrous women with tusks like those of wild boars, claws of gleaming bronze, and writhing serpents in place of hair. Among them, only Medusa holds a prominent place in mythology, her tale being the most well-known. We mention these beings primarily to introduce a compelling modern interpretation. Some scholars propose that the Gorgons and Graeae symbolize the perils of the sea. The Gorgons are thought to embody the formidable waves of the open ocean, their unyielding force akin to the raging waters of the deep. The Graeae, meanwhile, represent the white-crested breakers that crash against the shore, relentless and ever-present. Their names in Greek reflect these very attributes, suggesting that these mythological figures may have been inspired by the natural world's fury. Now, Perseus was the son of Jupiter and Danae. His grandfather, Perseus, was troubled by an ominous prophecy foretelling that his daughter's child would one day be the cause of his demise. Hearing his fate, Perseus confined Danae and her newborn son in a chest and cast them into the sea. The chest drifted to the island of Seriphus, where a fisherman discovered it and brought its occupants before King Polydectes, who took them under his protection. As Perseus matured into a formidable young man, Polydectes, seeking to rid himself of the youth, sent him on a perilous quest to defeat Medusa, the monstrous Gorgon, who had terrorized the land. Once a maiden of unparalleled beauty, Medusa had possessed hair so resplendent that it was the envy of all. However, when she dared to compare herself to Minerva, the goddess, in her wrath, stripped Medusa of her loveliness, transforming her flowing locks into writhing serpents. Medusa's visage became so horrifying that any living being who gazed upon her was instantly turned to stone. The cavern in which she dwelled was surrounded by petrified remains of men and beasts who had been unfortunate enough to set eyes upon her. Fortune, however, favored Perseus. Minerva and Mercury, divine patrons of heroes, lent him their aid. Minerva gifted him a polished shield, and Mercury bestowed upon him winged sandals. With these enchanted tools, Perseus approached Medusa as she lay in slumber, taking care to avert his gaze. He relied on the shield's reflective surface to guide his strike. With one swift motion, he severed Medusa's head and, victorious, presented it to Minerva, who affixed it to the center of her Aegeus. Forever wielding its petrifying power as a symbol of divine wrath and protection. Now, after vanquishing Medusa, Perseus, carrying the severed head of the Gorgon, soared across the vast expanse of land and sea. As night fell, he arrived at the westernmost edge of the world where the sun descends beyond the horizon. Here, weary from his journey, he sought refuge until dawn. This was the domain of King Atlas, a giant whose stature surpassed all men. His wealth lay in his countless flocks and herds, and he ruled unchallenged without rival or neighbor to dispute his dominion. Yet his greatest treasure was his orchard, where golden apples hung from branches of gold, concealed amidst gleaming golden leaves. Perseus approached and addressed the king. "I come as a traveler seeking hospitality. If noble lineage is esteemed, I claim Jupiter as my father. If heroic deeds hold merit, I offer the conquest of the Gorgon as proof. Grant me shelter and sustenance." But Atlas recalled an ancient prophecy foretelling that a son of Jupiter would one day steal his golden apples. With suspicion and resolve, he rebuffed the hero. "Leave at once. Neither your boastful heritage nor your vaunted exploits shall protect you." With this, he moved to drive Perseus away. Finding the giant's strength insurmountable, Perseus resolved to use his divine weapon. "If my presence offends you, then accept instead a gift," he declared. Turning aside to avoid its gaze, he lifted the Gorgon's severed head. Instantly, Atlas's immense form began to harden. His beard and flowing locks became dense forests, his mighty shoulders and limbs turned to towering cliffs, his head transformed into a lofty summit and his bones to solid rock. His entire being expanded until he became a colossal mountain, and thus, by the will of the gods, the heavens and their myriad stars came to rest upon his broad shoulders for all eternity. Perseus, continuing his flight, arrived in the land of the Ethiopians, where Cephas reigned as king. His queen Cassiopeia had been so prideful of her beauty that she dared to compare herself to the sea nymphs, provoking their wrath. In retaliation, the nymphs sent a monstrous sea creature to devastate the coastline. To placate the deities, the oracle decreed that Cephas must sacrifice his daughter Andromeda by exposing her to the beast's wrath. As Perseus soared above, he beheld the maiden bound to a rock, awaiting her grim fate. She was so pale and motionless that, but for the gentle movement of her hair in the breeze and the silent flow of her tears, she might have been mistaken for a marble statue. The sight so startled him that for a moment he forgot to beat his wings. Hovering near, he called out, "O maiden, undeserving of these cruel bonds, fit rather for the embrace of love, tell me your name, your lineage, and the reason for your plight." At first Andromeda hesitated, her modesty rendering her silent, and she would have concealed her face had her hands been free. But as Perseus pressed his questions, fearing he might mistake her silence for guilt, she revealed her name, her country, and the vanity of her mother that had led her to her suffering. Before she could finish speaking, a distant rumble echoed across the waters. A sea monster approached, its massive head breaking the surface as it cut through the waves. Andromeda shrieked, and her parents, who had rushed to the shore, stood helpless, their anguish palpable. Yet it was Cassiopeia, the root of this calamity, whose grief was most bitter. Perseus turned to them and declared, "This is no time for tears. We have to save her. We must act swiftly. As the son of Jupiter and the slayer of Medusa, I might well claim her hand as a suitor, but I prefer to win her by valor. If the gods grant me victory, let Andromeda be my reward." The king and queen, desperate to save their daughter, readily agreed, offering not only their daughter's hand, but a royal dowry. The monster drew closer, now within range of a well-aimed stone. With a sudden burst, Perseus launched himself into the sky. Like an eagle spying a serpent breaking in the sun and swooping down to seize it by the neck before it can strike, so did Perseus descend upon the beast. With a swift stroke, he drove his sword deep into its shoulder. Enraged, the monster reared and thrashed, then dove into the depths, only to rise again, thrashing like a wild boar beset by a pack of hounds. Perseus darted through the air, evading its attacks with the aid of his winged sandals. Seeking every opening, he struck whatever his blade could find purchase. Piercing its side, slashing at its flank, the beast roared in agony, spewing water mixed with blood from its nostrils. Soon the hero's wings were drenched, making them too heavy for flight. Alighting upon a jagged rock protruding from the sea, he steadied himself, grasping a ledge. As the wounded creature drifted near, he delivered the final blow, driving his sword into its vitals. A great cheer erupted from the assembled peoples, the sound reverberating through the hills. Overcome with joy, Cephas and Cassiopeia embraced Perseus, hailing him as their deliverer and the savior of their house. Andromeda, both the cause and prize of this glorious battle, was freed from her chains and descended from the rock, her eyes alight with gratitude and admiration for her champion. The jubilant parents, along with Perseus and Andromeda, retired to the palace, where a grand banquet awaited them. Joy and festivity filled the halls, but the revelry was abruptly interrupted by the sound of a warlike clamor. Phineas, Andromeda's former betrothed, stormed in with a host of adherents, demanding the maiden as his rightful bride. Cephas, rising in protest, declared, "You should have claimed her when she lay bound to the rock, condemned to the monster's prey. The decree of the gods that sentenced her to such a fate dissolved all previous engagements, as surely as death itself would have done." Phineas, unmoved by reason, hurled his javelin at Perseus, but the weapon missed its mark and fell harmlessly to the ground. In response, Perseus raised his own javelin to strike, but Phineas, lacking the courage to face him, took refuge behind the altar. His treacherous act served as a signal for his followers to attack the guests of Cephas, plunging the hall into chaos. A violent battle ensued, though Cephas withdrew, lamenting in vain and calling upon the gods to witness his innocence in this violation of sacred hospitality. For a time, Perseus and his allies bravely resisted the overwhelming force, but the sheer numbers of their foes threatened inevitable defeat. Then a sudden thought struck Perseus. He would turn his enemy's strength against itself. Raising his voice above the din, he called out, "If any here are my friends, avert your gaze." With that, he lifted the Gorgon's head high. "Do not think to terrify us with your tricks," scoffed Thessalus, as he poised his javelin to strike. But in that very moment, he froze, transformed into stone in the act of attack. Nearby, Ampyx prepared to drive his sword into a fallen foe, yet his arms stiffened, neither advancing nor retreating. Another warrior, mid-shout in a bellowing challenge, was suddenly silenced, his mouth left open in eternal speechlessness. Even one of Perseus's own allies, Aconteus, inadvertently caught sight of the Gorgon's visage and was turned to stone, his form forever rigid. Astyages, seeing his comrade transfixed, struck at him with his sword, but the blade rebounded with a ringing clang against the lifeless figure. Phineas beheld in horror the devastation wrought by his own aggression. Calling out to his followers, he received no answer. Reaching out to them, he found only cold, unyielding stone. In desperation, he fell to his knees, stretching out his hands to Perseus while turning his face away. "Spare me," he pleaded. "Take all, only let me live." Perseus regarded him with disdain. "Coward, this mercy I grant you. No blade shall harm you. Instead, you shall remain as a lasting monument to this day's folly." With that, he turned the Gorgon's head toward Phineas. The wretched man stiffened in his pose of supplication, hands outstretched, face averted, forever frozen in stone. And here's where we end for today. Young Tales is produced and narrated by Todd Young from Todd Young Online. If you enjoyed this, please like and subscribe and join us next time for another story. Thank you for your support.